Imagine you are a nobody with a key ring that matters more than your actual name. Imagine a sprawling, filthy city that smiles in the thin daylight but meticulously counts your church steps at night. You stand in AD 1605 London, close enough to the epicenter of power to smell its expensive parchment ink, yet far enough down the chain of command that this same power can crush you without even noticing your absence. Then, a letter lands on a polished oak table like a thrown knife. Stay away from Parliament. The ink is dark. The warning is cold. Promises a terrible, swift blow. It names no specific hand holding the weapon. It names no powder. It does not speak of fire, but it knows. It knows that the foundations of the world are about to violently crack. You move because small, insignificant people always move first. You do not debate intricate theology with bishops draped in imported white silk. You do not trade witty, dangerous jokes with lords who drink sweet wine from heavy silver goblets. You carry urgent messages. You open heavy, iron-bound doors. You follow sudden orders that arrive like freezing rain blowing off the gray Thames. Tonight, the air inside the grand palace corridors tastes of melting beeswax and damp, ancient stone, but the taste does not matter. The crushing urgency matters. You feel it in the rigid way men stop talking the second your iron-studded boots approach. You see it in the way a minor clerk's eyes flick away from yours, staring hard at the floorboards, as if making eye contact itself is sudden evidence of treason. You stand near the great, vulnerable throat of the kingdom, the Houses of Parliament, where laws rise like fortress walls and fall like executioners' hammers. Above you, the entire nation pretends it is stable, secure, blessed by God. Below you, under the rotting floorboards, everything can burn. Catholics watch Protestants with bitter resentment. Protestants watch Catholics with absolute dread. Courtiers watch each other like starving dogs circling a butcher's stall. You, small as you are, watch the heavy wooden doors that lead directly under the nation's throat. A warning letter exists. It sits on a desk, read by powerful men. Therefore, someone out there wants someone else kept alive. But who? Someone wants Parliament safe, therefore someone desperately wants credit for the rescue. But someone also wants Parliament deeply afraid, therefore someone craves total control over the resulting panic. Your job is not to answer these high treason questions. Your job is to walk into the dark and find the truth. A superior officer leans close enough that his hot breath brushes your ear. You smell sour ale and fresh ink. Search, the order implies, delivered without an ounce of ceremony. No grand speech, no priestly blessing, just heavy boots, rattling keys, and a quiet, suffocating urgency that makes even the flickering palace torches look nervous. You step into the vast palace yard, and the city beyond feels like a single held breath. Lanterns bob in the fog. Shadows jump against the brickwork. The River Thames is a black, freezing ribbon that carries treasonous whispers much faster than cargo barges. Somewhere in the distance, a heavy church bell marks the late hour, but time does not feel like normal hours anymore. Time feels like minutes stacked precariously on top of minutes, ready to topple and crush you. The very first search begins like a well-rehearsed stage performance, because everyone involved already knows the script. Lord Chamberlain Thomas Howard leads the procession. You see his men glance lazily toward the places danger is expected to be. Obvious wooden chests, brightly lit open rooms, friendly, swept corners. You feel the immense relief they want to feel, the intoxicating relief that comes from doing a dangerous job without actually having to do it. A dusty storeroom door opens. A quick glance inside. A dismissive shrug. A royal seal of approval that costs nothing and finds nothing. They see a massive pile of firewood in an undercroft, ask a servant a single question, accept his dull answer, and walk away. But the warning letter refuses to die. It sits behind every casual gesture made by the king's men. It insists that the careful words mean careful, violent hands are at work. You do not know who wrote this letter to Lord Monteagle. You do not know who truly receives its benefits. But you know this absolute truth. The letter does not scream. It whispers. Therefore, it fully expects to be read by someone who understands the deadly language of whispers. You pass administrative rooms where endless paperwork stacks like defensive bricks. You see men with soft, uncalloused hands moving sharp quills like actual blades. Their vicious wars happen in ink. Your brutal war happens in the freezing corridors. Someone in high authority smiles too quickly as the first search ends. acting as if the unknown danger is already boxed up and labeled. That specific, arrogant smile makes your stomach tighten into a knot. You feel the creeping, sickening suspicion that you are merely an extra in a grand play staged for an unseen audience sitting high above you. A Catholic plot threatens the Protestant realm. How incredibly convenient. A mysterious warning arrives just in time. How unbelievably fortunate. A theatrical search happens. How perfectly heroic. But then, hours later, a second order arrives, and this one is not theatrical. Sir Thomas Knivet steps out of the shadows. The new order is a vicious whisper that cuts straight to the bone. Search again. Search properly. Leave no shadow unchecked. The whisper carries genuine, sweat-drenched fear, but it also carries cold, political calculation. You do not know whether this second search actually saves the kingdom, or merely proves that someone in power already saves it and now wants the glory of the reveal. The heavy iron keys hanging on your leather belt suddenly weigh like millstones. You move purposefully toward the undercrofts, the dark underworld operating silently beneath the law. The grand palace above is all polished wood and endless talk. The forgotten palace below is rough stone and suffocating silence. You begin the descent. The stone steps are dangerously narrow. Your bare hand slides along a brick wall slick with old, foul-smelling damp. The weak torchlight in your fist does not chase the darkness away. It only wounds it temporarily. You see heavy wooden door after heavy wooden door, each one acting like a stubborn mouth that absolutely refuses to speak. You hear your own ragged breathing. It sounds too loud, too frail, too incredibly human in this stone gut. You force it quiet. You swallow the panic. You feel the humiliating, terrifying truth that if absolute danger waits down here, it waits mere inches away, not miles. Iron locks violently resist. Brass keys violently scrape. Rusted metal hinges complain softly in the dark, sounding exactly like they want to warn someone hiding inside. Every single delay steals a precious heartbeat from the kingdom's future. You desperately want to hurry, but hurrying makes noise. Noise alerts the prey. Noise makes you the prime target. Storage rooms slowly appear out of the gloom. Mounds of black coal, massive stacks of timber, bundled supplies that look perfectly harmless in the daylight. But you know this is exactly how utter catastrophe hides, snuggled safely inside the mundane and the ordinary. A wooden barrel is just a wooden barrel, right up until the exact moment it becomes the shape of a whole nation's fiery death. A hushed report filters down the line of men. Someone is down here, a living stranger, a servant guarding his master's winter fuel, they boldly claim. But your scouts return with jagged details that simply do not match the story. Some whisper he is entirely alone. Some swear he has heavily armed friends lurking in the next corridor. Some note he possesses the rigid posture of a veteran soldier, the terrifying, absolute calm of someone extensively trained to wait for extreme violence. You grip your weapon. You do not know whether you walk into a simple, confused arrest, or a lethal trap that ends with your throat opened and bleeding out in the dark. You push onward because the king's orders push far harder than your own fear. The stone corridor narrows sharply. The torch sputters, fighting for oxygen. Somewhere high above, the heavy palace creaks loudly, as if the sleeping state shifts in its violent dreams. Then the lantern light hits him. You see him. He stands exactly where a lowly servant stands, but he absolutely does not move like a servant. He stands like a man who firmly belongs to the exact place he stands, like an iron hinge just waiting to swing shut. He wears the plain, unadorned clothing of a hired caretaker, but his dark eyes do not beg for your pardon. They measure your exact distance. They measure your armor. They measure your throat. You do not yet have the true name ready in your mouth. You only know him as John Johnson. But later, the real name fiercely sticks to everything in the history books. Guy Fawkes. Tonight, right now, he is only a man with a chillingly calm face caught in the wrong corridor. Firewood. He states with a steady, unbreakable voice, as if the simple explanation completely ends the matter. He confidently claims he merely guards the fuel for his master, Thomas Percy. He presents the crafted story to you like a freshly minted coin, fully expecting you to accept it because it looks shiny and familiar. But the Monteagle warning letter sits like a parasite inside your skull now. Therefore, nothing familiar feels remotely safe. You slowly circle him. You see the dangerous way his hands rest. They are highly capable hands, scarred and thick, not soft servant hands. You see the sharp, heavy iron spurs on his boots. A man who stays indoors to guard firewood does not need riding spurs. You see the dark lantern sitting nearby. A man checking logs does not need a lantern designed to perfectly hide its own flame. You see the small tools resting at his leather belt. A caretaker does not need that kind of lethal readiness. Your actual authority down here is as thin as cheap paper. High above you, fine gentlemen argue endlessly about religion and statecraft while eating roasted meats. Down here in the damp, the entire decision sits heavily in your sweaty, unloved palms. You desperately want certainty. But certainty is an expensive luxury reserved strictly for people who never enter the undercrofts. You face a brutal choice that stings like cold iron against bare skin. Seize him right now and risk missing whatever he truly guards, or push past him to search deeper and risk that he draws a blade or runs. If you arrest the wrong man, you become a laughingstock fool. If you let the exact right man slip away, you and the entire government become falling ash. The royal chain of command above is a tangled maze. Orders travel down agonizingly slowly. Lethal danger travels instantly. You quietly signal for your men to step up. You keep your eyes locked unblinking on him. He does not flinch. That icy calm is not mere courage. It is fanatical preparation. It is the absolute calm of a burning fuse that truly believes it is invisible. He offers small, polite words. He offers a rigid obedience. But his entire body posture says something deeply terrifying. This corridor belongs to a massive plan, and you are currently trespassing in it. Time heavily presses down. The king arrives in mere hours. Therefore, you finally move. You force your way past him, refusing to turn your back fully, and plunge your boots deeper into the pitch-black undercroft. The second search instantly becomes violently real. The earlier search was just a dress rehearsal. This is the final performance that firmly decides who lives to see the dawn. It is incredibly late, hovering right near the dangerous hinge of midnight, slipping from the 4th into the 5th of November, AD 1605, and your raised lantern is a tiny, fragile sun that can be brutally murdered with a single breath. You lift the hot iron handle, and the weak light slowly crawls over a massive mountain of stacked timber and bundled faggots of wood. The very air tastes entirely wrong. It is not just river damp. It is not just old stone. Something else foul threads aggressively through the cold air, faint but needle-sharp, like raw sulfur waiting aggressively to be remembered. The metallic taste sits heavily on your tongue, acting as if your own mouth already knows the terrifying truth that your eyes have not yet proven. You take a heavy step forward, then another, the leather of your boots scraping loudly against the stone grit. You reach a trembling hand out toward the massive pile of wood, and your fingers brush against rough, cold bark. Normal. Nothing strange. You grab a log and pull. It stubbornly resists. You grit your teeth and pull much harder. The entire heavy stack dangerously shifts. You swiftly draw your steel blade, not because you expect to sword fight a pile of firewood, but because gripping the heavy hilt makes you feel slightly less like exposed meat. The metal is freezing. The pommel presses hard into your sweating palm, and you feel the angry tremor in your own hand, furiously angry at yourself for being so afraid. You violently drive the steel blade deep into the dark stack. The sharp point hits something that is absolutely not wood. The resulting sound is completely wrong. A dull, heavy knock, sickeningly hollow, exactly like striking the skin of a war drum. Your stomach violently drops because your survival instincts understand the reality long before your rational mind wants to accept it. You jam your cold fingers fiercely into the tight gaps between the logs and violently tear away the canvas cover and the brushwood. The curved face of an iron-hooped barrel immediately emerges from the dark. Then a second one. Then a third. This is not a careless few. This is not a hunter's personal stash. This is a massive structural wall of them. 36 barrels. 10,000 pounds of black powder. Each one tightly sealed. Each one sitting right there in the pitch black like a held breath that can instantly become a deafening, kingdom-ending scream. Your throat instantly locks tight. You do the brutal, terrifying math without wanting to. Parliament sits directly above your skull, completely packed with high-value targets that absolutely cannot run. King James I, his royal heirs, lords wrapped in velvet, bishops dressed in white, the entire state machinery dressed in its finest ceremony. You stand directly under the future of the world with a trembling candle in your hand. You vividly feel the terrifying absurdity of it all. Such a grand, wealthy nation, such a heavy, golden crown, all perfectly balanced over dirty wooden barrels like a drunken tavern prank. But this is definitely not a prank. This is a cold, calculated execution order carved directly into wood, iron, and saltpeter. Your lantern swings wildly as your arm violently jerks in pure shock. The tiny flame wobbles dangerously. For one horrifying blink of an eye, you clearly imagine it dropping. You imagine the thin glass breaking, you imagine the hot wick kissing the dust in the air. You feel your frantic heart slam so incredibly hard against your chest it seems to physically bruise your ribs. You clamp your fist around the lantern handle, holding it dead steady, acting as if your iron grip alone can keep the kingdom intact. Suddenly, right behind you, the stranger instantly moves. He is fast. He is not panicked. He is a pure professional. You hear heavy cloth quickly shift. You hear a sharp breath controlled entirely too well. You violently whirl around, and there he is, much closer than you ever expected, reaching for something, his strong body angled perfectly like a veteran who knows exactly where all the exits live. In his dark eyes, you clearly see the terrifying look of a zealot who fully expects history to obey his absolute command. You violently lunge. Your knee heavily scrapes the unforgiving stone floor. Hot pain flashes immediately up your leg. Your drawn blade catches the sputtering torchlight and throws it back in a bright, blinding slash. The lantern swings wildly again, and pure terror spikes in your veins because the fire is absolutely not your friend. It is your ultimate enemy tonight. One spark, just one stray spark, and London becomes a crater. He tries to forcefully slip past your guard. You slam violently into his chest with your leading shoulder. Your bodies collide with a heavy, sickening grunt that instantly turns into a ragged cough. The cold air suddenly fills with the raw smell of sour sweat, old stone, and that chemical sulfur hint that now feels exactly like the devil whispering directly into your ear. He violently twists. He is incredibly strong. He is heavily trained in the bloody wars of the Spanish Netherlands. His scarred hands dart aggressively for something hidden deep in his pockets. Slow matches, a length of fuse, touchwood, a small piece of flaming destiny. You do not know which specific weapon his fingers seek. You only know you absolutely cannot let him touch anything ever again. You ferociously tackle him to the floor. Heavy weight hits the unforgiving stone. Breath violently explodes out of both your lungs. Fine cloth violently tears. A heavy iron key ring rattles wildly against the floorboards like shattered teeth. Someone shouts in blind panic from the corridor. "What is it? What did you find?" Another desperate voice hisses angrily back. "Silence!" Your frantic fingers desperately find his thick wrists. They are incredibly steady, far too steady for a man being tackled. He fights exactly like someone who fully expects extreme pain and has already made his absolute peace with God. Someone blindly throws a coil of rough hemp rope into the dark. You blindly grab it and loop it hard, pulling fast, clumsy with pure adrenaline and urgency. The rough rope violently burns the palms of your hands. You pull aggressively until his thick hands cinch tight behind his back. He absolutely does not scream. That chilling silence is the exact part that frightens you the most. You tightly bind his hands, but you absolutely cannot bind the terrifying question tearing through your mind. How incredibly close is it? Minutes? Hours? Does it require a single dropped match? Or is a slow fuse already burning somewhere in the dark? You do not know how many days the barrels have quietly sat here. You do not know if 30 armed men wait just outside the door. You do not know if a secondary fuse lies hidden deep in the wood where your weak lantern light cannot possibly reach. You forcefully feel the confusing fog of war rapidly thicken. Finding the barrels does not end the danger. It massively multiplies it. Armed royal guards flood aggressively into the room, their heavy boots loudly clapping against the stone. Their harsh faces shift rapidly from angry confusion to absolute, paralyzing horror as the lantern light fully reveals the wall of barrels. You clearly hear a veteran soldier violently whisper a prayer to God, then suddenly stop, because prayer suddenly feels entirely too small for the scale of this death. Harsh orders loudly snap. Panicked voices quickly rise. Someone desperately runs upward to wake the sleeping palace. Someone else frantically runs to find much more rope. Someone simply stares blankly at the barrels, as if mere staring can somehow magically defuse them. The bound man on the dirt floor, Fox, though that specific name is still not fully yours to know, turns his head slightly. His dark eyes carefully track the chaotic movement around him, silently cataloging the guards, calculating the response time. He is not mentally done fighting. He is only temporarily interrupted. You roughly search his heavy pockets. small metal tools, an incredibly expensive pocket watch, a luxury no mere servant owns. Small items that feel perfectly ordinary until the context makes them absolutely monstrous. You find the slow matches. You find the touchwood. You feel the thin, deadly cord between your shaking fingers and clearly imagine it lit. You imagine the bright hiss, the crawling orange spark, the sudden, deafening roar. Your stomach violently flips. Someone violently spits a curse. Someone else loudly says, "God save the king." But the desperate words sound exactly like frantic begging, not royal certainty. High above you, the massive weight of Parliament still peacefully sleeps. It has absolutely no idea that oblivion waited patiently under its floor. Therefore, you force yourself to move fast. Men rush aggressively to secure the perimeter of the undercroft. The barrels are strictly not touched at first. Calloused hands hover near them, absolutely terrified. You see pure fear in strong veterans' eyes because this specific fear is entirely rational. Gunpowder is not a steel sword. You absolutely cannot parry it. You absolutely cannot talk it down. It requires zero skill to kill you. It only requires a spark. Fawkes is violently hauled up to his feet. His heavy boots drag across the stone. He keeps his head held high, not in foolish pride, but in a grim, absolute acceptance. You do not know if that chilling acceptance comes from deep religious faith, or from the terrifying knowledge that other deadly parts of the plot may still smoothly move out in the countryside. The massive palace above begins to aggressively stir. Heavy doors loudly bang open. Torches violently flare. High officials suddenly appear half-dressed, their faces pale and slick with sweat. Someone demands immediate answers with the sharp voice of a man completely used to being perfectly obeyed. The physical barrels finally become spoken words now. Gunpowder, someone loudly says, and the word itself seems to permanently stain the cold air. Enough to blow the whole place to the moon. Another guard answers, his voice severely cracking. You stand quietly in the undercroft for just a moment longer, staring directly at the stacked death, and you deeply feel something else lurking under the fear. The sick, overwhelming awe of the scale. This is not a drunken tavern brawl. This is a highly calculated attempt to entirely erase a government from the earth in one single violent breath. But true certainty still completely refuses to arrive. You know exactly what sits here, but you absolutely do not know the vast network operating behind it. You do not know if this is the only weapons cache in London. You do not know if a second, deadlier team waits to strike the king elsewhere when this specific trap fails. Dawn finally crawls through the dirty windows, and the undercroft is no longer a deadly secret. It instantly becomes a political stage. You see high officials gracefully come down the stairs, their fine leather shoes stepping carefully around the dirt, their faces aggressively tight as if the stone walls themselves might accuse them of treason. They fiercely stare at the exposed barrels with a kind of ravenous hunger, a hunger for relief, but mostly a hunger for a controllable narrative. The massive barrels are meticulously counted. They are publicly displayed. Careful words are chosen by men like Robert Cecil. Already, the chaotic, terrifying story begins to rapidly harden into something politically useful. Your fresh bruises instantly become physical proof that the state is perfectly vigilant. But your body absolutely does not stop shaking just because the officials start speaking in confident, booming tones. You keep aggressively thinking, why exactly is there a first search that conveniently finds absolutely nothing, and a second search that miraculously finds everything? Why does absolute danger arrive with just exactly enough time to be dramatically defeated? Who truly benefits from a massive threat that quietly ripens in the dark and only gets harvested when the light perfectly hits it? In the grand corridors above, rich men loudly talk about absolute loyalty as if loyalty is a gold coin that can be perfectly weighed. Fast messengers fly out on horseback. Warrants are violently readied. Hidden names start to rapidly move from quiet rumor into loud, bloody accusation. Fawkes is aggressively taken away. The terrifying words interrogation and the Tower of London slip violently through the palace like freezing drafts. You do not see what terrible things happen in those dark, damp rooms. You do not see the horrible stretching of the rack. You do not see the joints pop or the screaming that breaks a fanatic's mind. You only eventually see the shattered, barely legible signature, Guido, signed by a man whose hands have been destroyed. But you hear the massive building itself deeply hold its breath as the pain is administered. Ugly rumors quickly begin, and they move exactly like starving rats completely through the walls. Catholic houses are targeted. Secret basement masses are raided. Hidden priests suddenly vanish at dawn. Foreign powers watch greedily from across the rough water. Desperate men firmly believe the absolutely only way to be finally heard is to become deafening thunder. But another, much darker rumor also quietly creeps through the taverns, far more poisonous because it simply cannot be proven. Someone highly placed wanted this exact plot to smoothly ripen. Someone desperately wanted it to grow just large enough to absolutely justify a massive harvest of fear. Someone craved a nation to intimately watch a near-death experience, and then desperately beg the crown for heavy iron chains that perfectly feel like warm protection. You stand quietly in the hallways as the grand machinery of the state forcefully turns. You literally see raw fear become iron policy in real time. The massive state does not only brutally punish the original plotters, eventually drawing and quartering them in public to the cheers of the mob. It forcefully widens the circle. It aggressively tightens the net. It officially treats wild suspicion exactly like a tool, not a terrible shame. Paid informants instantly become high currency. A bitter neighbor's whisper suddenly becomes absolute evidence. A quiet Catholic prayer immediately becomes a potential hanging crime. You hear the harsh word Papist swung exactly like a bloody weapon. You see innocent men violently flinch at their own regional accents, their own family names, their own quiet pasts. People rapidly begin to loudly rehearse their absolute loyalty in public squares, because keeping your private loyalty completely silent suddenly feels dangerously like treason. The horrific punishment that rapidly follows carries the heavy smell of copper blood long before the blood ever actually spills. You hear that the condemned are absolutely not simply killed. They are forcefully made into screaming warnings. Their broken bodies become loud messages written entirely in torn meat, their heads placed on sharp spikes above London Bridge. You walk quietly near the massive crowds that aggressively swell to watch the executions. The faces around you look eager, absolutely terrified, and deeply hungry all at once. You feel the stifling heat of unwashed bodies pressed tightly together. You smell sour sweat, cheap beer, and something sharp and metallic in the air that absolutely does not come from copper coins. The state loudly performs brutal violence because the performance strictly teaches. It violently teaches the people exactly where the real power lives. It forcefully teaches them exactly what happens when that massive power ever feels remotely threatened. But the dark lesson completely fails to end with the bloody execution. It rapidly continues in thick law books. It aggressively continues in random midnight searches. It continues in the exact way a terrified city slowly learns to look entirely inward, highly suspicious, utterly divided. You deeply feel it happening. The kingdom officially learns a modern, terrifying lesson. Pure fear is massively easier to strictly govern when it is highly visible, loudly named, and endlessly repeated. Now, imagine violently stepping out of that dark undercroft and directly into the cold architecture of today. A handwritten warning letter rapidly becomes an intercepted digital message. The careful, whispered wording suddenly becomes tracked metadata. The subtle phrasing turned forcefully into a digital thread for an algorithm to aggressively pull. A terrifying midnight search with torches rapidly becomes a massive, warrantless digital sweep, totally justified because something terrible might happen. A horrific public execution instantly becomes an endless media cycle, played aggressively again and again on screens until the pure shock slowly turns into quiet, numb acceptance. You successfully survive the gunpowder barrels, but you instantly watch a brand new machine entirely wake up. The massive surveillance state that confidently promises you absolute safety, and then quietly asks you to live forever directly under its blinding lantern. You clearly see the dark pattern because you actively stand inside its very first heartbeat. A massive threat violently appears. Therefore, state power aggressively expands. But that power almost never, ever contracts again. The heavy locks that violently open in a state of emergency rapidly become permanent policies. The watchful eye that aggressively starts for just one terrible night keeps strictly watching forever. You deeply feel the powerful temptation. Total safety entirely feels like a warm, thick cloak when the freezing air is completely full of terrifying whispers. You fiercely feel the seduction of absolute certainty. Someone loudly says on a screen, "Just give up a little bit of your privacy, and there will absolutely be no more dark undercrofts full of hidden death." Someone confidently says, "Let the powerful state simply see more, and it can perfectly stop more." But you also intimately feel the crushing cost. Every single new search desperately needs a brand new suspect. Every single new security measure aggressively needs a brand new enemy. Therefore, the vast state rapidly begins to artificially manufacture absolute clarity. This specific group is dangerous, that specific faith is suspect, this specific neighborhood requires massive watching, that specific speech demands immediate regulating. Back in AD 1605, your bruised hands still deeply smell of rough rope burn and ancient damp stone. You vividly remember the tiny glass lantern swinging wildly above the explosive barrels. You perfectly remember exactly how incredibly close the tiny flame comes to absolute catastrophe. That horrifying closeness instantly becomes a heavily utilized weapon. It becomes the terrifying bedtime story repeatedly told to young children, aggressively told to Parliament, told to absolutely every official who desperately wants a larger security budget, told to every single citizen who ever hesitates to comply. Remember the 5th of November, they loudly imply. Remember exactly how near total death comes to your door. You desperately want to stand up and say, remember also exactly how that pure fear gets perfectly used, because the heavy uncertainty never truly clears. Yes, the massive barrels absolutely exist. Yes, the terrifying plot is entirely real. But the political manipulation is also aggressively real. The ruthless opportunism is real. The endless hunger for absolute control is entirely real. These dark truths coexist exactly like two sharp blades resting in the exact same leather sheath. Now the heavy dust finally settles. Verdict. You stand entirely quietly in the cold aftermath of the near explosion and meticulously count the invisible cost that completely fails to show up on the stone walls. The massive cost is absolutely not only the broken lives of the conspirators violently hunted down and physically torn apart. The heavy cost is the basic trust that permanently decays. The true cost is the quiet neighbor who rapidly learns to aggressively report another neighbor. The terrible cost is the private faith that instantly becomes a massive public target. The absolute cost is the dark idea that potential danger completely justifies absolutely any wooden door violently kicked in during the dark of night. Mirror. So, do you clearly see the exact same pattern actively operating today? Not the wooden barrels, those are completely obvious. The deep pattern. The convenient warning that magically arrives exactly just in time. The massive crisis that loudly demands immediate speed strictly over careful scrutiny. The political promise that aggressively watching millions of more people absolutely means far fewer people violently die. The warm comfort of being heavily protected, quietly purchased entirely with the complete surrender of being completely known. Legacy question. Imagine physically holding that tiny iron lantern again, your sweaty hand violently shaking, the weak flame wobbling precariously right above the black powder. You deeply feel the heat radiating on your scarred knuckles. You clearly hear the harsh orders echoing above you, highly impatient, violently hungry for a neat story. The real question is absolutely not whether the terrifying threat is real. The threat is always real. The terrifying question is who gets to absolutely decide exactly what happens right after. When total safety is forcefully offered entirely at the heavy price of permanent, unending watching, which exact part of your private life violently becomes the dark undercroft, and exactly who firmly holds the lit match.